What's up, everybody? I'm on a roll, so I'm just going to keep this thing going. All right, so let's go back to, and we're on the same property, so let's just keep it really simple. And I'm going to fill this out with you guys. So we know that we're going to be financing 500,000. And if you're getting this video separate from the other 1 to 4 family that I just went over, go back to that because this references that. It'll help you out a little bit. I'm going to put a 30-year note here. And gosh, interest rates are going up so high. I might even do like an 8.5% here. We're going to put another 30% here. And we're going to do 1% here. Okay, so let's explain what this all means, right? So the third-party financing always means that they are obtaining financing from a third party that would typically be a lender, okay? And in this scenario, they are going to do conventional financing. If they were doing something different like FHA, or if they're doing Texas Veterans Loan Program, or VA, or USDA, so on and so forth, you'll pick the appropriate paragraph. If they are doing a conventional financing and they're getting a second, you would put that here. But typically, this is what you're going to see, which is why I'm using this as an example. So the amount of money that they're getting lended or borrowed is going to be that 500K, right? Depends on whatever LTV they have, loan to value ratio that they have with the lender. And again, don't take these burden on yourself. Ask the lender what's going on when it comes to this, because they're the experts when it comes to the financing side. You're just brokering the transaction and guiding along your buyers and filling out the form appropriately to make sure that it's correct. Okay, so we got the $500,000 there. We're going to do the 30-year note, like I said, with an interest rate not to exceed 8.5% for the first 30 years, and origination charges not to exceed 1%. So the buyers are getting a loan estimate. That should be something that they're getting upon pre-approval. Now that loan estimate is critical. I know a lot of lenders unfortunately don't do this sometimes, but they should be getting a loan estimate that details all of their fees. When they're detailing their fees, they're going to show them what their closing costs are going to be. They're also going to show what their payment's going to look like, right? So at a certain interest rate, this is not the interest rate that they're getting quoted on the loan estimate. This is an interest rate that would be higher than that amount, because we want a loophole to be able to terminate if for whatever reason interest rates get crazy. And we know it's been pretty volatile, right? So let's just say we have World War III and interest rates go to, 12% or 18%. Well, based on this particular paragraph, we would have an ability to terminate and get our earnest money back if the interest rate exceeded this 8.5%. So that's why it's there. So both buyer's agents and seller's agents should be watching this form to make sure that it all makes sense based on what's happening with the market. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys out there. If you have questions on that, I'm happy to answer those questions, because it can be kind of a confusing topic, but you want to make sure this makes sense. So for example, right now, since interest rates are higher, that makes perfect sense. If you were to see something like this, well, that wouldn't make any sense, because we know that interest rates right now are much higher than that. So we would typically want to see something like this. And it may be slightly lower, give or take. I have not looked up rates to see what rates are currently, but let's just keep it with that. I can easily go into a rabbit hole, so I don't want to do that. Okay, so approval of financing. Let's move on, paragraph 2. So approval for the financing described above will be deemed to have been obtained when buyer approval and property approval are obtained. So buyer approval and property approval, two different things, okay? Time is of the essence for the paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. So if the buyer is not approved yet, which is many cases that's the case, right? They have a pre-qualification, they may not be approved yet. Usually we'll put anywhere from 14 to 21 days there. So for purposes of this market that we're in, which is kind of a neutral market right now, let's put about 14 days, okay? So the contract is subject to buyer obtaining approval. If buyer cannot obtain approval, buyer may give written notice to seller within 14 days after the effective date of this contract, which is, we know from the last contract, that's when all parties agree, and this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer does not terminate the contract under this provision, the contract shall no longer be subject to the buyer obtaining buyer approval. Buyer approval will deem to have been obtained when the terms of the loan described above are available and lender determines that the buyer has satisfied all the lender's requirements related to buyer's assets, income, and credit history. So that's that full approval. In some cases, this will be done before you're even submitting an offer, which is great. We have an in-house lender that we work with that does this, so we could even check off that this contract is not subject to buyer approval because they've already obtained that. But in many cases, that's not going to happen, which this gives you a little bit of a loophole if for some reason they start going through all the information necessary to qualify that buyer and that buyer does not qualify or does not get approved for that loan. So it's a good approval to have if you know that that buyer is not fully approved yet. And that's what this paragraph is used for. Now, disclaimer here. I used to really lean into this and say, hey, look, if you don't get approved for any reason, you'll get your earnest money back. No harm, no foul. They'll just hand you your money. It does not operate like that. You must understand that a release of earnest money will still need to be signed by the buyer and the seller. Since the title company is not a party to this contract, they cannot just send back the earnest money to the buyer without having that signature and approval from the seller's agent. Not the seller's agent, the sellers. So understand that both parties still have to sign off on that release. So it's sometimes not as easy to get that earnest money back. So be careful how you word this paragraph, but it is a loophole if for whatever reason they can't get that approval. Okay, but it says and, right? So there's also something known as property approval. Property approval is going to be pertaining to the property itself. So why would a property not be approved? Well, if it's got severe foundation issues, if it's uninsurable, like a roof is not sufficient, the roof needs to be replaced, and the seller's not interested in replacing that. Many reasons why a property can't be approved. That's what this paragraph is for, and it allows the buyer to terminate if for some reason they can't get those things done. This could also be subject to appraisal. Now, another disclaimer here. If your buyer is putting down 20% or more, they may not be able to terminate based on property approval, because even if that property doesn't appraise, they still may qualify under buyer approval, which means that they will have so much money down, they can move their funds around to make the transaction still work. And remember, the appraisal is going on the lower of the two amounts, so it's either the sales price or the appraised price. If the appraisal price is lower, they're going to use that amount and they're going to base the LTV based off of that. But if they're putting 20% down or more, they still can buy that property possibly. So be careful with telling your buyers that they can for sure terminate if the property doesn't appraise, because that's not necessarily true. The buyer must have the inability to buy that property in order to be able to terminate. And if they do have that capability and the lender can't write their name on something saying, hey, we can't get this person approved, then they may not be able to terminate based on that paragraph. So something to be mindful of. All right, so those are what those two paragraphs are for. If you're using FHA, you would have this provision as well. I usually will just do this just so there's no confusion there. Any blanks, I like to just put NA there. But that's a third-party financing. A very important form, but not a very difficult one to fill out. Hopefully that was helpful. Again, any paragraphs we need to dig into and give more explanation to, happy to do that in a separate video, but hopefully this was helpful for you guys.